Did you know that EPA recently issued final boiler rules that are anticipated to affect approximately 14,000 emission units at an annual compliance cost of $1.4 billion? Hello, I'm Paul Graywall, a director at Trinity Consultants. On February 23, 2011, the United States Environmental Protection Agency issued the following 4 final rules requiring additional controls and compliance requirements for new and existing boilers and industrial heaters. 1. The National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, or NESHAPs, for major sources of industrial, commercial, and institutional boilers and process heaters, codified under 40 CFR Part 63, Subpart 5D, known as the Boiler MACT. 2. National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Sources of Industrial, Commercial, and Institutional Boilers, 40 CFR Part 63, Subpart 6J, known as the Boiler GACT. 3. Guidelines of Performance for Commercial and Industrial Solid Waste Incineration Units, SISWI, under 40 CFR 60, Subpart 4C, also known as the SISWI Rule. 4. Identification of hazardous secondary materials that are solid waste when used as fuels or ingredients in combustion units, 40 CFR Part 241, Subpart B, known as the Solid Waste Definition Rule. These rules are intended to reduce emissions of hazardous air pollutants by over 30,000 tons per year. In these final rules, EPA made a number of changes from its 2010 proposal, generally relaxing regulatory requirements for both large, referred to as major sources, and smaller, referred to as area source, HAPs, based upon additional data and comments received during the public comment period. Let's look at a few important elements in the final major source NESHAP affecting larger sources of HAP emissions. First, EPA maintained work practice standards for natural gas and refinery gas units. In fact, EPA replaced emission limits with work practice standards for new gas-fired boilers with a capacity less than 10 million BTU per hour and maintained work practice standards for existing gas-fired boilers with a capacity of less than 10 million BTU per hour. EPA also developed work practice standards for startups and shutdowns. Disappointing many in industry, EPA rejected the incorporation of health-based compliance alternatives, or HBCA, and total select metal, or TSM limits, as an alternative to meeting the strict HAP emission limits contained in the standards. EPA also combined emission limits for biomass and coal into a single solid fuel subcategory. Finally, for existing units, EPA eliminated its Energy Star program requirements, but it is still requiring a one-time energy assessment. With respect to the final area source NESHAP, aimed at smaller sources of HAPs, EPA eliminated emission limits for existing biomass, oil-fired, and small coal-fired boilers, relaxed emission standards for new coal-fired boilers, as well as existing biomass and oil-fired boilers, and eliminated carbon monoxide standards for new biomass and fuel oil-fired boilers. The SISWI rule establishes standards for 5 subcategories of solid waste incineration units. In the final rule, EPA generally reduced the stringency of emission standards, some significantly. It also established emission standards for nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and sulfur dioxide for biomass and coal units, as well as separate standards for each of these fuel pollutant combinations. Burn-off ovens were excluded from regulation. EPA's final solid waste definition rule also included several noteworthy highlights. It included definitions for clean cellulosic biomass and resonated wood, and clarified that these materials are not considered solid waste. It also clarified the meaning of discarded with respect to scrap tires, and clarified that discarded scrap tires must be sufficiently processed to meet ASTM standards for relatively metal-free in order to avoid being classified as solid waste. Under both the major source and area source NESHAPs, compliance for existing boilers and process heaters is required by March 21, 2004, 3 years after the rules were published in the Federal Register. For new units, compliance is required upon startup. Before EPA finalized this suite of rules, it had requested an extension from the courts but was denied. EPA recognizes that there may be technical issues that merit further consideration and public input, so simultaneously to the final rule, EPA issued a request for reconsideration. This process will allow EPA to seek comments on specific elements, including new provisions that EPA may propose to modify in future rulemaking. For a more detailed analysis of these new standards, please visit Trinity's website and download the Spring 2011 issue of Environmental Quarterly. Stay tuned for further developments with respect to the boiler rules and associated regulatory updates, and contact Trinity to learn more about how EPA's initiatives may impact your operation.